Was crack-a-lackin' crew? It's Pitt, and I'm back with some more psychology. Today we will be diving back into the works of Carl Jung. This is Psychology and the Occult. We will be reading aloud and discussing as we go along the various points that are brought to light by the text. It is not the format for everyone, but people do find value in it, so you are more than welcome to tag along as we continue our exploration. Before we begin, however, if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in terminology, there will be several playlists linked in the box down below so that you can get a better understanding of who I am and why I say the things that I do. In addition, will be linked the original source material so that you can go back and research it for yourself. If you find value, I ask that you do all the wonderful things down below. Give me a like, a share, a follow, throw me a comment, whether you agree or disagree with anything that is stated. Put it in the box, and if it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If you truly find value, hit me with the super things. Consider joining for a membership or picking up a copy of one of my books. The one most relevant to today will be the one in the middle, The Green Stone, which is my work with spiritual alchemy. I give quite detailed instructions on how to create the Philosopher's Stone for yourself. With that being said, we are going to dive in and continue our exploration of psychology and the occult. The title's a lot longer, but with chapter 2, a case in somnambulism in a girl with poor inheritance, spiritualistic medium. The following case was under my observation during the years 1899 and 1900. As I was not in medical attendance upon Mrs. S.W., unfortunately, no physical examination for hysterical stigmata could be made. I kept a detailed diary in these seances, which I wrote down after each sitting. The report that follows is a condensed account from these notes. Out of regard for Mrs. S.W. and her family, a few unimportant data have been altered and various details omitted from her romances, which, for the most part, are composed of very intimate material. Anamnesis, that means recall, right? That is remembering something. Mrs. S.W., 15 years old, Protestant. The paternal grandfather was very intelligent, a clergyman who frequently had waking hallucinations, mostly visions, often whole dramatic scenes with dialogues, etc. A brother of her grandfather was feeble minded and eccentric who also saw visions. One of his sisters was also a peculiar, odd character. The paternal grandmother, after a feverish illness in her 20th year, typhoid fever maybe, had a trance lasting for 3 days, from which she did not begin to awake until the crown of her head was burnt with a red hot iron. Well, that is a therapeutic method that I am unaware of. Later on, like, can you imagine the sheer agony of that? I have been involved in being burned with red hot iron several times. I've got scars all over the place, and none of them are pleasant, right? Some places hurt a little bit more than others. I can imagine that the crown of the head would be a very sensitive area. Like, have you ever wrapped your crown, like hit it on something? It's excruciating, right? I can't imagine. Like, she's in a coma, basically, and they stick a red hot iron on her head and wake her up. Yeah, it's either going to wake you up or kill you, one or the other. Later on, when emotionally excited, she had fainting fits. I guess so. She couldn't get brain to her head where you cooked it. These were nearly always followed by brief somnambulism during which she uttered prophecies. The father, too, was an odd, original personality with bizarre ideas. Two of his brothers were the same. All three had waking hallucinations, second sight, premonitions, etc. A third brother was also eccentric and odd, talented, but one sided. The mother had a congenital psychopathic inferiority, often bordering on psychosis. One sister is a hysteric and a visionary, and another sister suffers from nervous heart attacks. Holy crap, you want to talk about a bad family to be born into, right? That is a terrible medical history. SW is of a delicate build, skull somewhat rachitic, though not noticeably hydrocephalic, face rather pale, eyes dark, with a peculiar penetrating look. She has had no serious illnesses. At school, she passed for average, showed little interest, was inattentive. In general, her behavior was rather reserved, but this would suddenly give place to the most exuberant joy and exaltation. Of mediocre intelligence, with no special gifts, neither musical nor fond of books, she prefers handwork or just sitting around daydreaming. Even at school, she was often absent minded, misread in a peculiar way when reading aloud. For instance, instead of the word zeig, goat, she would say geese, and instead of trep, stare, she would say stege. This happened so often that her brothers and sisters used to laugh at her. Otherwise, there were no abnormalities to be noticed about SW, and especially no serious hysterical symptoms. Her family were all artisans and business people with very limited interests. Books of a mystical nature were never allowed in the family. Her education was deficient. I bet it was. I bet there was a book of mystical nature that was allowed in there very much. I mean, there was one. Her education was deficient, apart from the fact that there were many brothers and sisters, all given a very casual education. The children suffered a great deal from the inconsequent, vulgar, and often brutal treatment they received from their mother, despite that mystical book. The father, a very preoccupied businessman, could not devote much time to his children and died when SW was still an adolescent. In these distressing circumstances, it is no wonder that she felt shut in and unhappy. She was often afraid to go home and preferred to be anywhere rather than here than there. Hence, when she was left a great deal with her playmates and grew up without much polish. Her educational level was accordingly pretty low, and her interests were correspondingly limited. Her knowledge of literature was likewise very limited. She knew the usual poems of Schiller and Goethe, and a few others poets, but learnt by heart at school. Some snatches from a songbook and fragments of the Psalms. Newspaper and magazine stories probably represented the upper limit in prose. Up to the time of her somnambulism, she had never read anything of a more cultured nature. Somnambulistic states. At home and from friends, she heard about the table turning and began to take an interest in it. She asked to be allowed to take part in such experiments, and her desire was soon gratified. In July 1899, she did some table turning several times in the family circle with friends, but as a joke. It was then discovered that she was an excellent medium. Communications of a serious nature arrived and were received amidst general astonishment. Their pastoral tone was surprising. The spirit gave himself out to be the grandfather of the medium. As I was acquainted with the family, I was able to take part in these experiments. At the beginning of August 1899, I witnessed the first attacks of somnambulism. Their course was usually as follows. SW grew very pale, slowly sank to the ground or into a chair, closed her eyes, became cataleptic, drew several deep breaths, and began to speak. At this stage, she was generally quite relaxed. The eyelid reflexes remained normal, and so did the tactile sensibility. She was sensitive to unexpected touches and easily frightened, especially in the initial stage. She did not react when called by name. In her somnambulistic dialogue, she copied in a remarkably clever way her dead relatives and acquaintances with all their foibles, so that she made a lasting impression even on persons not easily influenced. She could also hit off people whom she knew only from hearsay, doing it so well that none of the spectators could deny her at least considerable talent as an actress. Gradually, gestures began to accompany the words, and these finally led up to the attitudes passionnelles and whole dramatic scenes. She flung herself into postures of prayer and rapture with staring eyes, and spoke with impassioned and glowing rhetoric. On these occasions, she made exclusive use of literary German, which she spoke with perfect ease and assurance, in complete contrast with her usual uncertain and embarrassed manner in the waking state. Her movements were free and of a noble grace, mirroring the most beautifully her changing emotions. At this stage, her behavior during the attacks was irregular and extraordinarily varied. Now, she would lie for 10 minutes to 2 hours on the sofa or the floor, motionless with closed eyes. Now, she assumed a half sitting posture and spoke with altered voice and diction. Now, she was in constant movement, going through every possible pantomimic gesture. The content of her speeches was equally variable and irregular. Sometimes she spoke in the first person, but never for long, and then only to prophesy her next attack. Sometimes, and this was the most usual, she spoke of herself in the third person. She then acted some other person, either a dead acquaintance or somebody she had invented, whose part she carried out consistently according to the characteristics she herself conceived. The ecstasy was generally followed by cataleptic stages with flexibilitas aurea, which gradually passed over into the waking state. An almost constant feature was the sudden pallor which gave her face a waxen, anemic hue, which was positively frightening. This sometimes occurred right at the beginning of the attack, but often in the second half only. Her pulse was then low, but regular and of normal frequency. The breathing gentle, shallow, often barely perceptible. As we have already remarked, SW frequently predicted her attacks beforehand. Just before the attack, she had strange sensations, became excited, rather anxious, and occasionally expressed thoughts of death, saying that she would probably die in one of these attacks, that her soul only hung on to her body by a very thin thread, so that her body could scarcely go on living. That is very interesting. On one occasion, after the cataleptic stage, tachypnea was observed, lasting for 2 minutes with respiration of 100 per minute. At first, the attacks occurred spontaneously, but later SW could induce them by sitting in a dark corner and covering her face with her hands. But often, the experiment did not succeed, as she had what she called good and bad days. The question of amnesia after the attacks is, unfortunately, very unclear. This much is certain, that after each attack, she was perfectly oriented about the specific experiences she had undergone in the rapture. It is, however, uncertain how much she remembered of the conversations for which she served as a medium and of changes in her surroundings during the attack. It often looked as if she did have a vague recollection, for often she would ask immediately on awaking, "Who was there? Wasn't X or Y there? What did he say?" She also showed that she was superficially aware of the content of the conversations. She often remarked that the spirits told her before waking what they had said, but frequently this was not the case at all. If, at her request, somebody repeated the trance speeches to her, she was very often indignant about them and would be sad and depressed for hours on end, especially if any unpleasant indiscretions had occurred. She would rail against the spirits and assert that next time she would ask her guide to keep such spirits away from her. Her indignation was not faked, for in the waking state she could barely control herself and her effects, so that any change of mood was immediately reflected in her face. At times she seemed barely, if at all, aware of what went on around her during the attack. She seldom noticed when anyone left the room or came into it. Once she forbade me to enter the room when she was expecting special communications, which she wished to keep secret from me. I went in, nevertheless, sat down with the three other sitters, and listened to everything. SW had had her eyes open and spoke to the others without noticing me. She only noticed me when I began to speak, which gave rise to a veritable storm of indignation. She remembered better, but still only vaguely, the remarks of participants which referred to the trance speeches or directly to herself. I could never discover any definite rapport in this connection. Besides these big attacks, which seemed to follow a certain law, SW also exhibited a large number of other automatisms. Premonitions, forebodings, unaccountable moods, and rapidly changing fancies were all in a day's work. I never observed simple states of sleep. On the other hand, I soon noticed that in the middle of a lively conversation, she would become all confused and go on talking senselessly in a peculiar, monotonous way, looking in front of her dreamily with half closed eyes. These lapses usually lasted only a few minutes. Then she would suddenly go on. Yes, what did you say? At first, she would not give any information about these lapses, saying evasively that she felt a bit giddy, had a headache, etc. Later, she simply said, they were there again, meaning her spirits. She succumbed to these lapses very much against her will, often struggled against them. I don't want to, not now. Let them come another time. They seem to think I'm only there for them. The lapses came over in the street, in shops, and, in fact, anywhere. If they happened in the street, she would lean against a house and wait till the attack was over. During these attacks, whose intensity varied considerably, she had visions, very often and especially during attacks when she turned extremely pale. She wandered, or, as she put it, lost her body and was wafted to distant places where these spirits led her. That is an awful lot like astral projection, I believe. That is involuntary astral projection, which is a whole thing. I mean, that is, yeah, there's a lot to that. And you can talk about the grounding that is really necessary before you begin any of that. You got to talk about the attachments that you should make to yourself so that you don't have the problem of possible possession or dislocation. Like there's a lot of stuff in that, right? Distant journeys during ecstasy tired her exceedingly. She was often completely exhausted for hours afterwards, and many times complained that the spirits had again drained the strength from her. Such exertions were too much. The spirits must get another medium, etc. Once, she went hysterically blind for half an hour after the ecstasy. Her gait was unsteady, groping. She had to be led. Did not see the light that stood on the table, though the pupils reacted. Visions also came in large numbers, even without proper lapses, if we use this word, only for higher grade disturbances of attention. At first, they were confined to the onset of sleep. A little while after she had gone to bed, the room would suddenly light up, and shining white figures detached themselves from the foggy brightness. They were all wrapped in white, veil like robes. The women had things resembling turbans on their heads and wore girdles. Later, according to her own statement, the spirits were already there when she went to bed. Finally, she saw the figures in broad daylight, though only blurred and fleetingly, if there was no real lapse. Then the figures became solid enough to touch. But she always preferred the darkness. According to her account, the visions were generally of a pleasant nature. Gazing at the beautiful figures gave her a feeling of delicious bliss. Terrifying visions of demonic character were much rarer. These were entirely confined to nighttime or dark rooms. Occasionally, she saw black figures in the street at night or in her room. Once, in the dark hallway, she saw a terrible copper red face which suddenly glared at her from a very near and terrified her. I could not find out anything satisfactory about the first occurrence of the visions. She stated that in her fifth or sixth year, she once saw her guide at night, her grandfather, whom she had never known in life. I could not obtain any objective clues about this early vision from her relatives. Nothing more of the kind is said to have happened until the first seance, except for the hypnagogic brightness and seeing sparks. There were never any rudimentary hallucinations from the beginning. From the beginning, the hallucinations were of a systematic nature involving all the sense organs equally. So far as the intellectual reaction to these phenomena is concerned, which what is remarkable is the amazing matter of factness with which she regarded them. Her whole development into a somnambulist, her innumerable weird experiences, seemed to her entirely natural. She saw her whole past she saw her whole past only in this light. Every in any way striking event from her earlier years stood in a clear and necessary relationship to her present situation. She was probably definitely onto something, right? Like all of this has definite correlations or correlatives in other accounts, which are fairly reliable as well. I do believe that astral projection is a thing, and that appears to be what she did without the real understanding of what she was doing. Now, that was probably brought on by the circumstances, but it does appear that she at least had a valid experience. It was validated by people, right? She gave information that she shouldn't have had in a manner that was clearly verifiable by them, according to this. Uh, and that there were other things that are equally verifiable. And so it definitely seems like she had something going on, right? And this right here actually leans me more into believing that every, in any way, striking event from her earlier years stood in a clear and necessary relationship to her present situation is literally part of the greenstone work, right? That is part of creating the philosopher's stone is the understanding that every single event that has ever happened in your entire life is literally shaping you towards the present moment. And even if you are deviating from the highest path, that highest path remains available to you if you can take the information in and correct yourself. I mean, literally foundational. And so any striking event from the earlier years is a clear and necessary relationship to your present situation as well. It is exactly the same thing. And so that lends me more. This sentence right here by itself lends me more to believe her than the independently corroborated uh, things, right? And that's a little bit wild, right? That I wouldn't like base hypotheses upon this one sentence, but this is a confirmation that's not really meant to be a confirmation. And so it works for me. All right. She was happy in the consciousness of having found her true vocation. Naturally, she was unshakably conceived of the reality of her visions. I often tried to give her some critical explanation, but she would have none of it, since in her normal state she could not grasp a rational explanation anyway. And in her semi somnambulistic state, she regarded it as senseless in view of the facts staring her in the face. Right? Like you are in the middle of the experience and someone outside of the experience is trying to tell you that the experience is not real. Well, you can say whatever you want, right? I tell you quite often, I have had experiences. I cannot give them to you. I can only relate to you that they happen and you can either believe them or not. But those experiences become foundational, right? When you go through them and you become convinced, whether it is real or not, that they are true, they change foundationally the way that you look at everything, right? And so trying to rationalize away something that I know is not going to work, right? That is like trying to give me a reference that I know is incorrect, right? That I know is not a real thing, like calling from the book of Jasher, for instance. Everything about that book is made up. And so there is no way that I can take that to mean something if you use that as a reference. It's the same thing, right? You are arguing against something that I know, whether or not I can relay that in a way that you can understand it or not. And so I get that as well. She once said, I do not know if what the spirits say and teach me is true, nor do I know if they really are the people they call themselves. Very wise. But that my spirits exist is beyond question. I see them before me. I can touch them. I speak to them about everything I wish as naturally as I'm talking to you. They must be real. I know. I have had the angelic experience, right? An angel came to me, said, You are going to spread the word of God. That was the entire experience. There was no interaction, no conversation, nothing like that. And I've never had another entity or spirit or ancestor or guide or anything like that come to me other than that one experience in that particular way, right? I had my out of body where I was pulled and a witness creation. I didn't see any entities at that point. It was more of a feeling that there was someone there, but it wasn't a visible entity at all. Um, and so while I don't doubt that this is entirely possible, I don't have the experience with it to really talk about it in a way that other people could. Now, for me, the spirits manifest, I guess, as the voices, right? There's a voice of stasis and the voice of change. They are part of your psyche. It is not some like if something is telling you go kill these people and seems to be an outside voice like that, that is a whole separate thing than what I am talking about. Right? This is the you see a situation, you're like, this voice says you should do that, and it's right. And there's one that says, no, you should stay here, and it's not, right? You get to choose which one to do, and you get to choose which one of those voices you listen to, the positive or the negative, which one you manifest into your life. That is the subconscious and the unconscious fighting for your direction. And you are the active agent making the decisions inside of the vessel. And so you get to choose which one of those two to listen to. Right? It is the voice of intuition, the voice of inspiration, the muses, however it is expressed in whatever situation. For her, it manifests as guides. Now, I don't have the possibility of creating a vision for myself. Maybe if I did, they would manifest in that way. I mean, I can't say for sure one way or the other, but I don't necessarily discredit it. There are too many independently verified reasons not to just completely dismiss it. After I got hit by a car, I became a somnambulist as a child. Forever young. I get you, bro. Well, will be. Good morning, Gordy. She absolutely would not listen to the idea that manifestations were a kind of illness. And if it's not causing detriments, though, I mean, these things do happen and they can cause anxiety and things like that. But if it's not really manifesting in a detrimental situation, just because you don't believe in it doesn't mean that it's not true. Doubts about her health or about the reality of her dream world distressed her deeply. She felt so hurt by my remarks that she closed up in my presence and for a long time refused to experiment if I was there. Hence, I took care not to express my doubts and misgivings aloud. On the other hand, she enjoyed the undivided respect and admiration of her immediate relatives and acquaintances, who asked her advice about all sorts of things. Now, that could be a means or a reason for deceit. Right? If she is truly making these things up, or if she is genuinely deceived in the way that she is expressing these things, right? This sense of importance because of being able to do it is definitely something that can lead to you being deceitful in the situation. In time, she obtained such an influence over her followers that three of her sisters began to hallucinate too. The hallucinations usually began as night dreams of a very vivid and dramatic kind, which gradually passed over into the waking state, partly hypnagogic, partly hypnopompic. A married sister, in particular, had extraordinary vivid dreams that developed logically from night to night and finally appeared in her waking consciousness, first as indistinct illusions and then as real hallucinations. But they never reached the plastic clearness of SW's visions. Thus, she once saw in a dream a black demonic figure at her bedside in vigorous argument with a beautiful white figure who was trying to restrain the black. Nevertheless, the black figure seized her by the throat and started to choke her. Then she awoke. Bending over her, she saw a black shadow with human outlines, and near it a cloudy white figure. The vision disappeared only when she lighted the candle. Similar visions were repeated dozens of times. That is why grounding is so very important. The visions of the other two sisters were similar, but less intense. The type of attack we have described, with its wealth of fantastic visions and ideas, had developed in less than a month, reaching a climax which was never to be surpassed. What came later was only an elaboration of all the thoughts and the cycles of visions that had been more or less foreshadowed right at the beginning. In addition to the big attacks and the little lapses, whose content, however, was materially the same, there was a third category that deserves mention. These were the semi somnambulistic states. They occurred at the beginning or end of the big attacks, but also independently of them. They developed slowly in the course of the first month. It is not possible to give a more precise date for their appearance. Was especially noticeable in this state was the rigid expression of the face, the shining eyes, and a certain dignity and stateliness of movement. In this condition, SW was herself, or rather her somnambulist ego. She was fully oriented to the external world, but seemed to have one foot in her dream world. She saw and heard her spirits, saw how they walked round the room among those present, standing now by one person and now by another. She had a clear memory of her visions, of her journeys, and the instructions she received. She spoke quietly, clearly, and firmly, and was always in a serious, almost solemn mood. Her whole being glowed with deep religious feeling, free from any pietistic flavor, and her speech was in no way influenced by the biblical jargon of her guide. Her solemn behavior had something sorrowful and melancholy about it. She was painfully conscious of the great difference between her nocturnal, ideal world and the crude reality of day. This state was in sharp contrast to her waking existence. In it, there was no trace of that unstable and inharmonious creature, of that brittle nervous temperament which was so characteristic of her usual behavior. Speaking with her, you had the impression of speaking with a much older person who, through numerous experiences, had arrived at a state of calm composure. It was in this state that she achieved her best results, whereas her romances corresponded more closely to her waking interests. The semi somnambulism usually appeared spontaneously, as a rule, during the table turning experiments, and it always began by SW's knowing beforehand what the table was going to say. She would then stop table turning, and after a short pause, would pass suddenly into an ecstasy. She proved to be very sensitive. She could guess and answer simple questions devised by a member of the circle who was not himself a medium. It was enough to lay a hand on the table or on her hands to give her the necessary clues. Direct thought transference could never be established. Besides the obvious broadening of her whole personality, the continued existence of her ordinary character was all the more startling. She talked with unconcealed pleasure about all her little childish experiences with the flirtations and love secrets, the naughtiness and rudeness of her companions and playmates. To anyone who did not know her secret, she was just a girl of 15, uh, different, no different from thousands of other girls. So much the greater was people's astonishment when they came to know her other side. Her relatives could not grasp the change at first. Part of it they never understood at all, so that there were often bitter arguments in the family, some of them siding with SW and others against her, either with gushing enthusiasm or with contemptuous censure of her superstition. Mhm. Thus, SW, during the time that I knew her, led a curiously contradictory life, a real double life, with two personalities existing side by side in succession, each continually striving for mastery. I will now give some of the most interesting details of the seances in chronological order. Records of seances. First and second sittings, August of 1899. SW at once took control of the communications. The psychograph, for which an overturned tumbler was used, the two fingers of the right hand being placed upon it, moved with lightning speed from letter to letter. Slips of paper marked with letters and numbers had been arranged in a circle around the glass. It was communicated that the medium's grandfather was present and would speak to us. There now followed numerous communications in quick succession, most of an edifying religious character, partly in properly formed words and partly with a letter transposed or in reverse order. These latter words and sentences were often produced so rapidly that one could not follow the meaning and only discovered it afterwards by reversing the letters. That is an interesting thing, right? Not entirely outside of the realm of possibility to be able to fake, but if you can't keep up with her doing it, it's very likely that she's going to have a hard time doing it herself. I mean, that lends more into the auto side of it rather than the fallacious side. Once the messages were interrupted in brusque fashion by a new communication announcing the presence of the writer's grandfather. Why so many downvotes? What's going on here? There is absolutely no telling. Probably somebody is doing a troll for my content from the last couple of weeks. Uh, but yeah, there's absolutely no telling. I didn't know it was happening, so interaction's interaction. It's all cool. You don't like it, you are more than welcome to not like it. The presence of the writer's grandfather. Someone remarked jokingly, Evidently, the two spirits don't get on very well together. Darkness came on during the experiment. Suddenly, SW became very agitated, jumped up nervously, fell on her knees, and cried, "There, there. Don't you see that light? That star there?" She grew more and more excited and called for a lamp in terror. She was pale, wept, and said she felt queer, did not know what was the matter with her. When a lamp was brought, she quieted down. The experiments were suspended. At the next sitting, which took place 2 days later, also in the evening, similar communications were obtained from SW's grandfather. When darkness fell, she suddenly lay back on the sofa, grew pale, closed her eyes to a slit, and lay there motionless. Yeah, there's a lot of people who are not very happy with my content over the last couple of weeks because I have a tendency to tell the truth whether people like it or not. And so it's not unusual for people to pop up like that. I'm surprised they're not here flaming in the comments. Right, that generally happens as well. But it's perfectly fine for anybody to disagree. Like I don't like as long as the disagreeable comments stay respectful. Right, I have no problem with it. Most of the time, YouTube has more of a problem with the comments than I do. So, uh, I have so many controversial beliefs that I know that people will react badly to them. So the eyeballs were turned upward, the eyelid reflex was present, also tactile sensibility, respiration gentle, almost imperceptible, pulse low and feeble. And that is definitely not outside of the realm of possibility. Right? I'm trying not to talk about whose people it probably is, but they know who they are. So uh, this condition lasted about half an hour, whereupon she suddenly got up with a sigh. The extreme pallor of the face, which had lasted all through the attack, now gave way to her usual rosy color. She was somewhat confused and embarrassed, said she had seen all sorts of things, but would tell nothing. Only after insistent questioning would she admit that in a peculiar waking condition she had seen her grandfather arm in arm with my grandfather. Then they suddenly drove past, sitting side by side in an open carriage. Third sitting. In this, which took place a few days later, there was a similar attack of more than a half an hour's duration. SW afterward told of many white, transfigured forms who each gave her a flower of special symbolic significance. Most of them were dead relatives. Concerning the details of their talk, she maintained an obstinate silence. Fourth sitting. After SW had passed into the somnambulistic state, she began to make peculiar movements with her lips, emitting at the same time gulping and gargling noises. Very interesting. Then she whispered something unintelligibly, very softly. When this had gone on for some minutes, she suddenly began speaking in an altered, deep tone of voice. She spoke of herself in the third person. "She is not here. She is gone away." There now followed several sentences in a religious vein. From their content and language, one could see that she was imitating her grandfather, who had been a clergyman. The gist of the talk did not rise above the mental level of the communications. The tone of voice had something artificial and forced about it, and only became natural when, in due course, it grew more like the medium's own. In later sittings, the voice only altered for a few moments when a new spirit manifested itself. Afterwards, she had no remembrance of the trance conversation. She gave hints about a sojourn in the other world and spoke of the unimaginable blessedness she felt. It should be noted that during the attack, her talk was absolutely spontaneous and not prompted by any suggestions. Immediately after the sitting, SW became acquainted with Justinius Kerner's book, Die Scheihan de Provost. She thereupon began to magnetize herself towards the end of the attacks, partly by means of regular passes, partly by strange circles and figures of eight, which she executed symmetrically with both arms at once. She did this, she said, to dispel the severe headaches that came after the attacks. In other August sittings, not detailed here, the grandfather was joined by numerous kindred spirits who did not produce anything very remarkable. Each time a new spirit appeared, the movements of the glass altered in a startling way. It ran along the row of letters, knocking against some of them, but in no sense could be made of it. The spelling was very uncertain and arbitrary, and the first sentences were often incomplete or broken up into meaningless jumbles of letters. In most cases, fluent writing suddenly began at this point. Sometimes automatic writing was attempted in complete darkness. The movements began with violent jerkings of the whole arm, so that the pencil went right through the paper. The first attempt consisted of numerous strokes and zigzag lines about 8 centimeters high. Further attempts first produced illegible words written very large. Then the writing gradually grew smaller and more distinct. It was not much different from the medium's own. The control spirit was, once again, the grandfather. Fifth sitting. Somnambulistic attacks in September 1899. SW sat on the sofa, leant back, and shut her eyes, breathing lightly and regularly. She gradually became cataleptic. The catalepsy disappeared after about 2 minutes, whereupon she lay there, apparently sleeping quietly, muscles quite relaxed. Suddenly, she began talking in a low voice. No, you take the red, I'll take the white. You can take the green, and you take the blue. Are you ready? Let's go. Pause of several moments, during which her face assumed a corpse like pallor. Her hands felt quite cold and were quite bloodless. Suddenly, she called out in a loud, solemn voice, Albert, Albert, Albert. Then in a whisper, Now you speak. Followed by a longer pause, during which the power of her face reached its highest conceivable intensity. Again in a loud, solemn voice, Albert, Albert, don't you believe your father? I tell you there are many mistakes in N's teaching. Think about it. Pause. The power decreased. He's very frightened. He couldn't speak any more. These words in her usual conversational tone. Pause. He will suddenly think about it. She went on speaking in the same conversational tone, but in a strange idiom that sounded like French and Italian mixed, recalling now one and now the other. She spoke fluently, right? Like she has an accent like mine, right? It changes depending on me, right? In the middle of the accent, it'll change. She spoke fluently, rapidly, and with charm. It was possible to make out a few words, but not to memorize them because the language was so strange. From time to time, sudden words recurred, like weena weenies, wenai wene, etc. The absolute naturalness of the performance was amazing. Now and then she paused as if someone were answering her. Suddenly she said in German, Oh dear, is it time already? In a sad voice, Must I go? Goodbye, goodbye. At these words, there passed over her face an indescribable expression of ecstatic happiness. She raised her arms, opened her eyes, till now closed, and looked upwards radiantly. For a moment, she remained in this position, then her arms sank down slackly. Her face became tired and exhausted. After a short cataleptic stage, she woke up with a sigh. I've slept again, haven't I? She was told she had been talking in her sleep, whereupon she became wildly annoyed, and her anger increased still more when she learned that she was talking in a foreign language. But I told the spirits I didn't want to. I can't do it, it tires me too much. Began to cry. Oh God, must everything come back again like last time? Am I to be spared nothing? The next day, at the same time, there was another attack. After SW had dropped off, Ulrich van Gerbenstein suddenly announced himself. He proved to be an amusing gossip, speaking fluent High German with a North German accent. Asked what SW was doing, he explained with much circumlocution that she was far away and that he was here meanwhile to look after her body, its circulation, respiration, etc. He must take care that no black person got hold of her and harmed her. Well, that's kind of racist, right? I mean, this was a different time. They had different sensibilities. I mean, we don't have to agree with it. It is just the record. On insistent questioning, he said that SW had gone with the others in Japan to look up a distant relative and stop him from doing a stupid marriage. He then announced in a whisper the exact moment when the meeting took place. Forbidden to talk for a few minutes, he pointed to SW's sudden pallor, remarking that materialization at such great distances caused a corresponding amount of strength. He then ordered cold compresses to be applied to her head so as to alleviate the severe headache which would come afterwards or might be caused by the cold compresses. With the gradual return of color to her face, the conversation became more animated. There were all sorts of childish jokes and trivialities. Then UVG suddenly said, I see them coming, but they are still very far off. I see her there like a little star. SW pointed to the north. We naturally asked in astonishment why they were not coming from the east, whereupon UVG laughingly replied, they came the direct way over the North Pole. I must go now. Goodbye. Immediately afterwards, SW awoke with a sigh, in a bad temper, complaining of a violent headache. She said that she had seen UVG standing by her body. What had he told us? She was furious about the silly chatter. Why couldn't he lay off of it for once? Sixth sitting. Began in the usual way, extreme pallor. Lay stretched out, scarcely breathing. Suddenly she spoke in a loud, solemn voice. Well then, be frightened. I am. I warn you about N's teaching. Look, in hope there is everything needed for faith. You want to know who I am? God gives where one least expect it. Don't you know me? Then, unintelligible whispering. After a few minutes, she woke up. Seventh sitting. SW soon fell asleep, stretched out on the sofa, very pale, said nothing, sighed deeply from time to time, opened her eyes, stood up, sat down on the sofa, bent forward, saying softly, You have sinned grievously, have fallen far. Bent still further forward, as if speaking to someone kneeling in front of her. Stood up, turned to the right, stretched out her hand, and pointed to the spot over which she had been bending. Will you forgive her? She asked loudly. Do not forgive men, but their spirits. Not she, but her human body has sinned. Then she knelt down, remained for about 10 minutes in an attitude of prayer. Suddenly, she got up, looked to heaven with an ecstatic expression, and then threw herself on her knees again, her face in her hands, whispering incomprehensible words. Remained motionless in this attitude for several minutes. Then she got up, gazed heavenward again with radiant countenance, and lay down on the sofa, waking soon afterwards. My mother had schizophrenia. She used to talk constantly. I asked her about it. She would say she's dreaming. Oftentimes, it would be in a thick accent that wasn't her own. Reminds me of her. It does sound a lot like that, too. And that is where it gets really hard to differentiate, right? Like, where do you tell the difference between a true, actual vision that is only the experience of this one person and a genuine delusion, right? It has to be borne out in the fruit of what comes from it, right? The sociopathic or schizophrenic type of people aren't going to have verifiable fruit to come out. The genuines will, right? This lady apparently has evidences that were independently corroborated, right? That was what the report was. And so it is a believable thing that it is possible, but it is the exact same matrix, right? It really is because, like, I literally deal with this because my neighbor he is schizophrenic, refuses to take his medicine. Like, it's a whole deal. He broke my leg last April. Uh, and so I get to witness that, right? He walks around mumbling to himself and talking to himself all the time. He has convinced himself that I am the devil, like literally, even though he is claims to be Agamemnon, the demon from Revelation, literally. And so, like, he is convinced everything bad in his life is from me. And he does that by wandering around, muttering to himself through the middle of the night with a spotlight on his head. Like, we've got so much on camera. It's wild. Or we did. We don't anymore. But, and so I get to see that in real life, right? Religious delusions, because that is where the foundation of his thing came from. And so, yeah, like I fully commiserate with that. And it is hard to differentiate between the two, and it has to be borne out by fruit, right? If it is leading you down a dark path, probably not good fruit. Um, Development of the somnambulistic personalities. At the beginning of many seances, the glass was allowed to move by itself, and this was always followed by the stereotyped invitation: "You must ask a question." Since several convinced spiritualists were attending the seance, there was, of course, an immediate demand for all manner of spiritualistic marvels, especially for the protecting spirits. At these requests, the names of well known dead persons were sometimes produced, and sometimes unknown names such as Berth de Valois, Elizabeth von Thierfelsenberg, Ulrich von Gerbenstein, etc. The control spirit was, almost without exception, the medium's grandfather, who once declared that he loved her more than anyone in the world because he had protected her from childhood up and knew all of her thoughts. This personality produced a flood of biblical maxims, edifying observations, and songbook verses, also verses he had presumably composed himself, like the following: "Be firm and true in thy believing, to faith in God cling ever nigh, thy heavenly comfort never leaving, which having man can never die. Refuge in God is peace forever, when earthly cares oppress the mind, who from the heart can pray is never bowed down by fate, however unkind." Numerous other effusions of this sort betrayed by their hackneyed, unctuous content their origin in some tract or other. From the time SW began speaking in her ecstasies, lively dialogues developed between members of the circle and the somnambulist personality. The gist of the answers received was essentially the same as the banal and generally edifying verbiage of the psychographic communications. Yeah. Schizophrenia and neurotic left hemisphere of our brain always leads to fragmentation, dissociative actions, to neglect accountability. And that, right, I've got a real life example of that. Right. I live on about a half-acre lot, right? My neighbor's is a little bit smaller than that. And he decided at some point that he was gonna dig a ditch between our lots, right? He came to the notion that he is facing a drainage issue. There is no drainage issue. I have worked with soil and drainage extensively, right? We don't have any of those problems. But he got out there in the middle of the night while drinking and dug a ditch between our houses, literally on top of the utilities, and then recorded a video, which is still on Facebook, blaming me for it. Like, not just dissociating himself from the consequences, but from the very actions themselves. Like, he did this. We have him on camera doing it. And then we have him on camera filming himself saying that I did it. And so the dissociation and the fragmentation, that is a real thing. Like, he is like, it's wild. Like, he called the police one time and told them that I had put dog shit inside of his garage. And the police came out and looked and they're like, "That's an oil stain." And he's like, "Yeah." Like, complete disassociation, like complete fragmentation of reality. So yeah, definitely. The character of the personality was distinguished by a dry and tedious solemnity, rigorous conventionality, and sanctimonious piety, which does not accord at all with historical reality. The grandfather was the medium's guide and protector. During the ecstasies, he offered all kinds of advice, prophesied later attacks and what would happen when she woke, etc. He ordered cold compresses, gave instructions concerning the way that the medium should lie on the couch, arrangements for sittings, and so on. His relationship to the medium was exceedingly tender. In vivid contrast to this heavy footed dream personage, there appeared a personality who had cropped up occasionally in the psychographic communications of the first sittings. He soon disclosed himself as the dead brother of the late Mr. R, who was then taking part in the seances. This dead brother, Mr. PR, peppered his living brother with commonplaces about brotherly love, etc. He evaded specific questions in every possible way. At the same time, he developed a quite astonishing eloquence towards the ladies of the circle, and in particular paid his attentions to a lady whom he had never known in life. He stated that even when alive, he had always raved about her, had often met her in the street without knowing who she was, and was now absolutely delighted to make her acquaintance in this unusual manner. His stale compliments, pert remarks to the men, innocuous childish jokes, etc., took up a large part of the seances. Several members of the circle took exception to the frivolity and banality of the spirit, whereupon he vanished for one or two sittings, but soon reappeared, at first well behaved, often with Christian phrases on his lips, but before long slipping back into his old form. Besides these two sharply differentiated personalities, others appeared who varied but little from the grandfather type. They were mostly dead relatives of the medium. The general atmosphere of the first 2 months' seances was accordingly solemn and edifying, disturbed only from time to time by PR's trivial chatter. Yeah. A few weeks after the beginning of the seances, Mr. R left our circle, whereupon a remarkable change took place in PR's behavior. He grew monosyllabic, came, left often, and after a few sittings vanished altogether. Later on, he reappeared occasionally, and mostly only when the medium was alone with the lady in question. Then a new personality thrust himself into the forefront. Unlike PR, who always spoke with Swiss dialect, this gentleman affected a strong North German accent. In all else, he was an exact copy of PR. His eloquence was astonishing, since SW had only a very scanty knowledge of High German, whereas this new personality, who called himself Ulrich von Gerbenstein, spoke an almost faultless German, abounding in amiable phrases and charming compliments. Ulrich von Gerbenstein was a gossip, a wag, and an idler, a great admirer of the ladies, frivolous and extremely superficial. During the winter of 1899 1900, he came to dominate the situation more and more, and took over one by one all the above mentioned functions of the grandfather, so that the serious character of the seances visibly deteriorated under his influence. efforts to counteract it proved unavailing, and finally, the seances had to be suspended on this account for longer and longer periods. One feature which all these somnambulist personalities have in common deserves mention. They have at their disposal the whole of the medium's memory, even the unconscious portion of it. They are also all au courant with the visions she has had in the ecstatic state, but they have only the most superficial knowledge of her fantasies during the ecstasy. Of the somnambulistic dreams, they only know what can occasionally be picked up from the members of the circle. On doubtful points, they can give no information, or only such as contradicts the medium's own explanations. The stereotyped answer to all questions of this kind is ask a Venice. A Venice knows. From the examples we have given of the different ecstasies, it is clear that the medium's consciousness is by no means idle during the trance, but develops an extraordinarily rich fantasy activity. In reconstructing her somnambulistic ego, we are entirely dependent on her subsequent statements. For, in the first place, the spontaneous utterances of the ego associated with the waking state are few and mostly disjointed. And in the second place, many of the ecstasies pass off without pantomime and without speech, so that no conclusions about inner processes can be drawn from external appearances. SW is almost totally amnesiac in regard to the automatic phenomena during ecstasy, insofar as these fall within the sphere of personalities foreign to her ego. But she usually has a clear memory of all the other phenomena directly connected with her ego, such as talking in a loud voice, glossolalia, etc. In every instance, there is complete amnesia only in the first few moments after the ecstasy. During the first half hour, when a kind of semi somnambulism with reveries, hallucinations, etc., is still present, the amnesia gradually disappears, and fragmentary memories are come up of what has happened, though in a quite irregular and arbitrary fashion. The later seances usually begin by our joining hands on the table, whereupon the table immediately started to move. Meanwhile, SW gradually became somnambulistic, took her hands from the table, lay back on the sofa, and fell into an ecstatic sleep. She sometimes related her experiences to us afterwards, but was very reticent if strangers were present. Even after the first few ecstasies, she hinted that she had played a distinguished role among the spirits. Like all the spirits, she had a special name, and hers was a Venice. Our grandfather surrounded her with quite particular care, and in the ecstasy with the flower vision, she learned special secrets about which she still maintained the deepest silence. During the seances, when her spirit spoke, she made long journeys, mostly to relatives whom she visited, or she found herself in the beyond, in that space between the stars, which people think is empty, which really contains countless spirit worlds. In the semi somnambulistic state that frequently followed her attacks, she once gave a truly poetic description of the landscape in the beyond. A wonderful moonlit valley that was destined for generations as yet unborn. She described her somnambulistic ego as a personality almost entirely freed from the body. A small but fully grown black haired woman of a markedly Jewish type, clothed in white garments, her head wrapped in a turban. As for herself, she understood and spoke the language of the spirits, for the spirits still speak with one another from human habit, although they don't really need to because they can see one another's thoughts. She did not always actually talk with them. She just looked at them and knew what they were thinking. She traveled in the company of 4 or 5 spirits, dead relatives, and visited her living relatives and acquaintances in order to investigate their life and way of thinking. She also visited all of the places that lay on her ghostly beat. After becoming acquainted with Kerner's book, she, like the clairvoyante, felt it her destiny to instruct and improve the black spirits who were banished to certain regions or who dwell partly beneath the earth's surface. This activity caused her a good deal of trouble and pain, both during and after the ecstasies. She complained of suffocating feelings, violent headaches, etc. I bet that's I bet that was not the wisest of activities to partake in. What is she doing? She is instructing and improving the black spirits, the spirits of stasis. Okay, you can expend your energy how you wish. That is probably not the wisest way to do it. But every fortnight, on Wednesdays, she was allowed to spend the whole night in the gardens of the beyond in the company of the blessed spirits. There, she received instruction concerning the forces that govern the world and the endlessly complicated relationships between human beings, and also concerning the laws of reincarnation, the star dwellers, etc. That is something that I detail a little bit in my first book. Unfortunately, she expatiated only on the system of world forces and reincarnation, and merely let fall an occasional remark concerning the other subjects. For instance, she once returned from a railway journey in an extremely agitated state. We thought at first that something unpleasant must have happened to her, but finally she pulled herself together and explained that a star dweller had sat opposite her in the train. From the description she gave of this being, I recognized an elderly merchant I happened to know, who had a rather unsympathetic face. Apropos of this event, she told us all the peculiarities of the star dwellers. They have no godlike souls as men have. They pursue no science, no philosophy, but in the technical arts they are far more advanced than we are. Thus, flying machines have long been in existence on Mars. The whole of Mars is covered with canals. The canals are artificial lakes and are used for irrigation. Well, we now know that that is absolutely not true, right? And unless you believe that the sky is a projection, right? Unless you believe that we're on a flat earth and there is a firmament and there is no real space out there, if you believe in astronomical observation, if you believe in telescopic visions, right? Like real ones, not like you scoping your vision in your imagination, but using a telescope to have visions of the far distant places. If you believe in those things, then you know that this is not a true thing, right? Even like the face on Mars has been shown to not really be a face, right? The pyramids on Mars are not pyramidal. These are things. And most of the things that were considered to be canals and stuff along that nature of artificial device are absolutely not, right? There are places where evidently water did flow at some point in time in history. There are canals that were naturally formed between those places, right? But not any evidence whatsoever of terraforming by intelligence. And so this is one of the things that we can just casually dismiss these days. And I probably just got a whole nother wave of thumbs down. The canals are all flat ditches. The water in them is very shallow. The excavating of the canals caused the Martians no particular trouble, as the soil there is lighter than on Earth. There are no bridges over the canals, but that does not prevent communication because everybody travels by flying machine. Yeah, we are well into the realm of fantastical. There are no wars on the stars because no differences of opinion exist. The star dwellers do not have a human shape, but the most laughable ones imaginable, such as no one could possibly conceive. Human spirits who get permission to travel in the beyond are not allowed to set foot on the stars. Similarly, traveling star dwellers may not touch down on Earth, but must remain at a distance of some 7 feet above its surface. Should they infringe this law, they remain in the power of the Earth and must take on human bodies, from which they are freed only after their natural death. As human beings, they are cold, hard hearted, and cruel. SW can recognize them by their peculiar expression, which lacks the spiritual, and by their hairless, eyebrowless, sharply cut faces. Napoleon, one, was a typical star dweller. We also see this occurring today, right? We have the Pleiadians among us. We have several different star descendant groups that have self identified as such. Now, there is no real reason to believe that any extraterrestrials have made it, right? There are phenomena which are definitely non explainable, right? But more likely, there is some civilization that resides somewheres on the earth than that they came from somewhere else. The distances are vast, right? There's not a star base on the moon, for instance. Not that we know of, right? Now, we can get into all kinds of arguments about whether there is some conspiracies. I am a big conspiracy hound, but as far as evidence goes, there is no evidence to believe that there is Martian life, that there is life on the moon, that there is regular visitations between the planets. It is much more likely that these phenomenon, if they occur and are some other entity, it is on a different plane of existence, a reality that we don't understand. I mean, we don't really understand the realities underneath ours, much less the ones above ours. And if we see a physical manifestation of something, I do not dismiss, right? There could be some civilization living in a hollow earth. I don't necessarily lend a whole lot of weight to that theory, but it is a theory. Uh, they may have interstellar travel. That is entirely a possibility. It is beyond any real conception of practicality for us today, right? You would have to create a wormhole or something along that nature. And so, for most of this, we can casually dismiss it, right? That's not to say that it is absolutely impossible. There are a lot of things that are improbable and not impossible. On her journeys, she did not see the places through which she hastened. She had the feeling of floating, and the spirits told her when she was in the right spot. Then, as a rule, she saw only the face and upper part of the person whom she wished to appear or whom she wanted to see. She could seldom say in what kind of surroundings she saw this person. Occasionally, she saw me, but only my head, without any background. She was much occupied with the enchanting of spirits, and for this purpose wrote oracular sayings in foreign tongue on slips of paper, which she concealed in all sorts of queer places. Especially displeasing to her was the presence in my house of an Italian murderer, whom she called Conventi. She tried several times to cast a spell on him, and without my knowledge concealed several slips of paper about the place, which were later found by accident. Wait, Why did you have an Italian murderer in your house? Is there a story about that? That's interesting. Why do you have this? Are you just collecting murderers? Like, what's going on there? One of them had the following message written on it in red pencil. If you're watching, you can do this. I'm not going to try. Unfortunately, I never managed to get a translation, for in this matter, SW was quite unapproachable. Occasionally, the somnambulistic Venice spoke directly to the public. She did so in dignified language that sounded slightly precocious, but Venice was not boringly unctuous or irrepressibly silly like her two guides. She is a serious, mature person, devout and right minded, full of womanly tenderness and very modest, who always submits to the opinions of others. There is something soulful and elegiac about her, an air of melancholy, resignation. She longs to get out of this world. She returns unwillingly to reality. She bemoans her hard lot, her odious family circumstances. With all this, she is something of a great lady. She orders her spirits about, despises von Gerpenstein's stupid chatter, comforts others, succors those in distress, warns and protects them from dangers to body and soul. She is the channel for the entire intellectual output of all the manifestations, though she herself ascribes this to the instruction by the spirits. It is Venice who directly controls SW's semi somnambulistic state. The romances. The peculiar ghost like look in SW's eyes during her semi somnambulism prompted some members of the circle to compare her to the clairvoyante of Prevorst. The suggestion was not without consequences. SW gave hints of earlier existences she had already lived through, and after a few weeks, she suddenly disclosed a whole system of reincarnations, although she had never mentioned anything of the sort before. Venice, she said, was a spiritual being who had certain advantages over the spirits of other human beings. Every human spirit must embody itself in the course of the centuries, but Venice had to embody herself at least once every 200 years. Apart from her, only two human beings shared this fate, namely Swedenborg and Mrs. Florence Cook, Crookes's famous medium. SW called these two personages her brother and her sister. She gave no information about their previous existences. At the beginning of the 19th century, Venice had been Frau Hauf, the clairvoyant of Prevorst. At the end of the 18th century, a clergyman's wife in central Germany, locality unspecified, in which capacity she had been seduced by Goethe and had borne him a son. In the 15th century, she had been a Saxon countess with the poetic name of Thierfelsenberg. Ulrich von Gerbenstein was a relative from that time. The lapse of 300 years before her next incarnation and the slip up with Goethe had to be atoned for by the sorrows of the clairvoyante. In the 13th century, she had been a noblewoman with the name de Valois in the south of France and had been burnt as a witch. From the 13th century back to the time of the Christian persecutions under Nero, there had been numerous reincarnations of which SW gave no account. During the Christian persecutions, she had played a martyr's part. Then came another great darkness, back to the time of David, when Venice had been an ordinary Jewess. After her death as such, she had received from Astaph, an angel in one of the higher heavens, the mandate for her wonderful career. In all her pre-existences, she had been a medium and an intermediary between this world and the beyond. Her brothers and sisters were equally old and had the same profession. In each of her pre-existences, she had invariably been married, and in this way founded a colossal family tree, with whose endlessly complicated relationships she was occupied in many of her ecstasies. Thus, sometime in the 8th century, she had been the mother of her earthly father and, what is more, of her grandfather and mine. Hence, the remarkable friendship between these two old gentlemen, otherwise strangers. As Madame de Velour, She had been my mother. When she had been burnt as a witch, I had taken it very much to heart. I had retired to a monastery in ruin, wore a gray habit, became prior, wrote a work on botany, and died at over 80 years in age. In the refectory of the monastery, there had hung a portrait of Madame de Valour, in which she was depicted in a half sitting, half reclining position. SW, in the semi somnambulistic state, often assumed this position on the sofa. It corresponds exactly to that of Madame Recamier in David's well known painting. A gentleman who often took part in the seances and bore a distant resemblance to me was also one of her sons from that time. Around this core of relationships, there now grouped themselves at a greater or lesser distance all the persons in any way related or known to her. One came from the 15th century, another was a cousin from the 18th century, and so on. From the three great family stocks, there sprang the greater part of the races of Europe. She and her brothers and sisters were descended from Adam, who arose by materialization. The other races then in existence, from among whom Cain took his wife, were descended from monkeys. From these interrelated groups, SW produced a vast amount of family gossip, a spate of romantic stories, piquant adventures, etc. The special target of her romances was a lady acquaintance of mine, who, for some undiscoverable reason, was peculiarly, that word is so hard for me, antipathetic to her. She declared that this lady was the incarnation of a celebrated Parisian poisoner who had achieved great notoriety in the 18th century. This lady, she maintained, still continued her dangerous work, but in a much more ingenious and refined fashion than before. Through the inspiration of the wicked spirits who accompanied her, she had discovered a fluid which, when merely exposed to the air, attracted any tubercle bacilli flying about and formed a splendid culture medium for them. By means of this fluid, which she was in the habit of mixing with her food, she had caused the death of her husband, who had indeed died from tuberculosis, also of one of her lovers and of her own brother, so as to get his inheritance. Her eldest son was an illegitimate child by her lover. During her widowhood, she had secretly borne an illegitimate child to another lover, and had finally had illicit relations with her own brother, whom she later poisoned. In this way, SW wove innumerable stories in which she believed implicitly. The characters in these romances also appeared in her visions, as, for instance, this lady in the above mentioned vision with its pantomime of confession and forgiveness of sin. Anything at all interesting that happened in her surroundings was drawn into this system of romances and given a place in the family relationships with a more or less clear account of the pre existences and influencing spirits. So it fared with all persons who made SW's acquaintance. They were rated as a second or a first incarnation according to whether they had a well marked or an indistinct character. In most cases, they were also designated as relatives and always in the same quite definite way. Only afterwards, often several weeks later, a new and complicated romance would suddenly make its appearance after an ecstasy, explaining the striking relationship by means of pre existences or illegitimate liaisons. Persons sympathetic to SW were usually close relatives. These family romances, with the exception of the one described above, were all composed very carefully so that it was absolutely impossible to check up on them. They were delivered with the most amazing aplomb and often surprised us by the extremely clever use of details, which SW must have heard or picked up from somewhere. Most of the romances had a pretty gruesome character. Murder by poison and dagger, seduction and banishment, forgery of wills, and so forth played a prominent role. Mystic science. SW was subjected to numerous suggestions in regard to scientific questions. Generally, towards the end of the seances, various subjects of a scientific or spiritualistic nature were discussed and debated. SW never took part in the conversation, but sat dreamily in a corner in a semi somnambulistic condition. She listened now to one thing and now to another, catching it in a half dream, but she could never give a coherent account of anything if one asked her about it, and she only half understood the explanations. In the course of the winter, various hints began to emerge in the seances. The spirits brought her strange revelations about the well forces and the beyond, but she could not say anything just now. Once, she tried to give a description, but only said, on one side was the light, on the other side, the power of attraction. That is an interesting characterization. Finally, in March 1900, after nothing more had been heard of these things for some time, she suddenly announced with a joyful face that she had now received everything from the spirits. Sorry. She drew forth a long, narrow strip of paper on which numerous names were written. Despite my request, she would not let it out of her hands, but told me to draw a diagram. I can remember clearly that in the winter of 1899 1900, we spoke several times in SW's presence of attractive and repulsive forces in connection with Kant's natural history and theory of the heavens, also of the law of conservation of energy, of the different forms of energy, and of whether the force of gravity is also a form of motion. From the content of these talks, SW had evidently derived the foundations of her mystic system. She gave the following explanations. The forces are arranged in 7 circles. Outside of these are 3 more, containing unknown forces midway between force and matter. Let's see if we can get this in here. I just to get a look, right? We got primary force in the middle, magnesium life force, Hephapergus electricity, connoisseur endos tusa, nacus, gravity, and the other forces. So this has got electricity and gravity in the same ring, which is pretty close to true, but you got gravitation outside of it, which is not going to be. You've got life force right here with endos and hypsos, magnesior and connoisseur. Like some of these words I would have to look up, but like magnetism and electricity is inseparable, right? They are light, heat. That is all. It's on the wrong ring, but it is the right designation. And read my book, Series of Unconventional Beliefs, or watch me read it to you or through the free playlist. We do describe those rings, though. All right, back to the text. Matter is found in the 7 outer circles surrounding the 10 inner ones. In the center stands the primary force. This is the original cause of the creation and is a spiritual force. The first circle, which surrounds the primary force, is matter. No, but it is not a true force and does not arise from the primary force, but it combines with the primary force, and from this combination arise other spiritual forces. And you have primary force, then you have motion, and then you get matter. And on one side of the good or light powers, magnesior, and on the other side, the dark powers, connoisseur. That is not entirely untrue. We spoke earlier about the two sides of the story, right? The forces of change and the forces of stasis. I express that in black and white. It is in alchemy expressed the exact same way. It is the representative of fire and water. There is a whole explanation that goes into that. The Green Stone, which is my second book, we do discuss that in some very great detail. If you are interested, the playlist is linked down below. The Magnesaur power contains and that is the balancing between these two forces is literally how you make the Philosopher's Stone. So, all right. The Magnesaur power contains the most primary force, and the Connoisseur power the least, since there the dark power of matter is the greatest. The further the primary force advances towards the outwards, the weaker it becomes. That would be the strong attractive force, right? The strong attractive force is the one in the middle. It is very strong in very small locations. The weak attractive force is outside of that and it's a bit repulsive to that, but it is more reaching out. The further the primary force advances sours, the weaker it becomes, but weaker too becomes the power of matter, since its power is greatest where the collision with the primary force is most violent. An example, the connoisseur power. And right, this is the primary and secondary, right? Both are expressed here. The strong attractive and the weak attractive, and the point at which they meet is indeed the strongest point, right? You can hold planets in stasis at those meeting points. And by in stasis, I mean in orbit. The system could also be written out in a single line or column, beginning with primary force, Magnusor, Kafar, etc., and then going from left to right on the diagram, up through Tusa and Endos to Connoisseur. But in that way, it would be difficult to see the different degrees of intensity. Every force in an outer circle is composed of the nearest adjacent forces of the inner circle, the Magnusor group. From Magnusor descend in a direct line the so called powers of light, which are only slightly influenced by the dark side. Magnusor and Kafar together form the life force, which is not uniform but is differently composed in animals and plants. Man's life force stands between Magnusor and Kafar. Morally good persons and mediums who facilitate miscommunication between good spirits and the earth have most Magnusor. Somewhere about the middle are the life forces of animals, and in Kafar, those of plants. Nothing is known about Hefa, or rather, SW can give no information. Persis is the basic force that manifests itself in the forces of motion. Its recognizable forms are heat, light, electricity, magnetism. That would be spirit. And the two unknown forces, one of which is to be found only in comets. Of the forces in the sixth circle, SW could only name north and south magnetism and positive and negative electricity. Deca is unknown. Smar is of no special significance, to be discussed below. It leads over to the Hippos group. Hippos and Hyphonism are powers which dwell only in certain human beings, and those who are able to exert a magnetic influence on others. A theoloby is the sexual instinct. Chemical affinity is directly derived from it. In the seventh, and that would be unity, right? That would be sacral, right? If affinity is directly derived from it, that is true as well. In the seventh circle comes inertia. Sodas and Kara are of unknown significance. Pusa corresponds to Smar in the opposite sense. Like I would have to sit down with the chart and these definitions to do a direct correlation, but most of these things are not, just wild, right? They do have basis in even some extra knowledge. The Knesser group. Knesser is the counterpole to Magnusor. It is the dark and evil power, equal intensity to the good power of light. Again, those powers. And the good power create what the good power creates, it turns into its opposite. Endos is a basic power in minerals. From Tusa, significance unknown, is derived gravitation, which in its turn is described as the basic power manifesting itself in the forces of resistance, gravity, capillarity, adhesion, and cohesion. Nakus is the secret power in a rare stone, which counteracts the effects of a snake poison. Quit reading, Agrippa. The two powers, Smar and Pusa, have a special significance. According to SW, Smar develops in bodies of morally good people at the moment of death. This power enables the soul to ascend to the powers of light. That is DMT. Pusa works in the opposite way, for it is the power that leads the morally bad soul into the state of Knesser on the dark side. There's only a hell if you create one. With the sixth circle, the visible world begins. This appears to be so sharply divided from the beyond only because of the imperfection of our organs of sense. In reality, the transition is a very gradual one, and there are people who live on a higher plane of cosmic knowledge because their perceptions and sensations are finer than those of other human beings. Such seers are able to see manifestations of force where ordinary people can see nothing. This is something that I can do. I don't often talk about it because it doesn't come up an awful lot, but I can see the emanations, right? I don't see particular colors very often, right? People see auras. It's basically the same thing. I don't see the colors associated with it. I do, however, see the forces surrounding people, plants, to a smaller level, the inanimate things, but not a whole lot. But the plants, animals, and people will express it. Like you can really see it moving. And so I do have a little bit of experience with this particular part of it. Um, SW sees Magnosaur as a shining white or bluish vapor. The bluish vapor is closer to what I see, which develops when good spirits are near. There are no spirits necessarily around, however. Conessor is a black fuming liquid, a black fuming fluid, which develops on the appearance of black spirits. Uh, for me, this is going to be the differentiator, right? How do I explain this? All right, a mirage, right? A mirage it consists of some parts. What you see is the wavering lines that go up, right? Those wavering lines is very, very similar to the surrounding of the blue. The black here is the defining parts that are the separations between the waves, right? It is almost like an encapsulation. You can see through part of it, but you see the lines on the outside edges, right? You see, it's almost like looking through the glass, right? And you can see in here that this is yellow, but it's a little bit darker towards the side because the light bends around it. That is the black, right? And you literally use both sides of that if you are doing it correctly, right? Black is not necessarily evil, white is not necessarily good. Good and evil are relative terms in a lot of ways. Some ways are absolutely definitive, but a lot of the other ones are very much up to grabs. Sometimes the power of change, which is the white or the blue here, is going to be the positive, right? Sometimes remaining the same is not the direction to go. And sometimes remaining the same and not changing is going to be the positive. To attribute to either one of those an absolute good or evil is not correct. The correct way to look at it is that it is entirely situational. Sometimes you are going to be required to stay the same. Sometimes you will be required to change. Using both of those in balance is how you fully encapsulate or fully, uh, what would be the word? Allow yourself to enjoy your highest potential. Mm. And that's, yeah. On the night before the great visions began, the shiny Magnosaur vapor spread around her in thick layers, and the good spirits solidified out of it into visible white figures. It was just the same with Connoisseur. These two forces have different mediums. SW is a Magnosaur medium, like the clairvoyant of Prevost and Swedenborg. The materialization mediums of the spiritualist are mostly connoisseur mediums, since materialization takes place much more easily through connoisseur on account of its close connection with the properties of matter. In the summer of 1900, SW tried several times to produce a picture of the circles of matter, but she never got beyond vague and incomprehensible hints, and afterwards spoke of it no more. Termination of the disorder. The really interesting and significant seances came to an end with the production of the power system. Even before this, the vitality of the ecstasies had been falling off considerably. Ulrich von Gerbenstein came increasingly to the forefront and filled the seances for hours on end with his childish chatter. The visions which SW had in the meantime likewise seem to have lost much of their richness and plasticity of form, for afterwards she was only able to report ecstatic feelings in the presence of good spirits, and disagreeable ones in that of bad spirits. Nothing new was produced. In the trance conversations, one could observe a trace of uncertainty, as if she were feeling her way and seeking to make an impression on her audience. There was also an increasing staleness of content. In her outward behavior, too, there was a marked shyness and uncertainty, so that the impression of willful deception became ever stronger. The writer, therefore, soon withdrew from the seances. SW experimented later in other circles, and 6 months after the conclusion of my observations, was caught cheating in flagrante. She wanted to revive the wavering belief in her supernatural powers by genuinely spiritualistic experiments like a port, etc. And for this purpose, concealed in her dress small objects which she threw into the air during dark seances. After that, her role was played out. Since then, 18 months have gone by, during which I have lost sight of her, but I learned from an observer who knew her in the early days that now and again she still has rather peculiar states of short duration, when she was very pale and silent and has a fixed, glazed look. I have heard nothing of any more visions. She has also said not to take part any longer in spiritualistic seances. SW is now an employee in a large business, and he is, by all accounts, an industrious and dutiful person who does her work with zeal and skill to the satisfaction of all concerned. According to the report of trustworthy persons, her character has much improved. She has become, on the whole, quieter, steadier, and more agreeable. No further abnormalities have come to light. And that is where we're going to go ahead and start wrapping this one up. Hopefully, I brought a little bit of alignment and not too much confusion to a somewhat difficult series of topics. I understand that I hold some unconventional beliefs, and I do have a tendency to step on toes when I relay those. It is not intentional. It's not what I apologize for. Uh, this one was fairly straightforward, right? This is a clinical accounting of someone else's experience. I had a few points of salient reference, but for the most part, it's just a reading into the history, right? I'm going through making sure that I've got all the groundwork. We're going to do psychology and the occult, and then we're moving on to the archetypes and the collective unconscious. And then we're into ion, which ultimately led into the Mysterium Conjunctionis, which we have already done. Uh, and so this is just making sure that I understand the argument completely. That I I wrote the Greenstone as the completion of the Mysterium Conjunctionis because it is spiritually or spiritual alchemy, right? Jung was missing that key, right? The key that is in the Greenstone, in my estimation, is the key that he was missing. That he would have been able to do a lot more than he was able to in his own particular understanding of that work if he would have had the one particular key, right? The understanding of the two forces being the actual Holy Spirit. The Trinity is four parts, right? There is the body, the mind, the soul, or the body, the soul, and the spirit, right? You are the soul inside of the body, and the spirit is what makes everything happen. The positive and the negative, that is the spirit. The attractive forces, the repulsive forces, the blue, the black, however it's described, that's what it is. Every single instance of heat, light, motion, change, decision, anything along that nature, the active element uses that to enact change. You are the deciding factor as the primary representative in the temple that is the incarnation that is the earth. All of these things, right? We are going to get to. I am very much anticipating getting into ion in particular, right? The archetypes has its purpose. I did rewrite the MBTI system, changed it into something that actually functions more objectively. Uh, and so I'm looking forward to that one too. But ion, I really am looking forward to discussing more of the spiritual alchemy side of things. That's why we made the pivot this week, right? This last 7 days into the direction we are currently going. If you have found value, I ask that you do all of the wonderful things down below. Give me a like, a share, a follow. Whether you agree or disagree, leave me a comment. If it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If you have truly found value, I ask that you hit the super things. Consider joining for a membership, picking up a copy of one of my books, or reaching out to me through the links provided down below. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are. And this has been pittstake. Peace. Thank you. That'll work.